"Do not enter that car." 3 words, whispered in Korean. And the most dangerous man in the building froze. His right hand was already reaching for the door handle. It stopped mid-air, suspended, motionless, like his body had received a signal his mind had not yet processed. The underground parking garage was silent except for the low murmur of the idling engine and the distant rhythm of rain somewhere far above them. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The woman who had spoken stood 12 steps behind him, her heart perfectly steady, waiting for him to decide what she was. She had come back for a bag. A forgotten ordinary bag sitting in the security booth near the elevator. That was all. And somehow that one small careless oversight had walked her directly into the most consequential moment of her life. Standing in a cold underground garage, having just warned a Korean Mafia boss away from a car she had every reason to believe he would not survive, with 2 Russian bodyguards behind her whose hands had gone very, very still. If these opening lines already have you locked in, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Like this video and drop a comment telling us what language you wish you secretly spoke. Because this is a story about a black girl who used hers to stop a war and accidentally lost her heart in the middle of it. Stay with us. It only gets deeper from here. Her name was Serena, 29 years old, daughter of a British diplomat who had spent her entire childhood being uprooted from one country and replanted in another before the previous soil had finished washing off her shoes. Lagos at 6, Moscow at 9, Seoul at 13, London at 17, just long enough to finish school and develop the particular resilience of someone who had learned that home was not a place but a practice. She had grown up speaking languages the way other children grew up collecting things, not as a hobby but as survival. Russian had entered her at 9 in a Moscow winter she still felt in her bones whenever temperatures dropped without warning. Korean had arrived at 13 with the stubbornness of a language that rewards only those willing to meet it completely on its own terms. She had met it completely. Her father had insisted. Not with force but with the quiet conviction of someone who understood that the world revealed its most important secrets only to those who bothered to learn its languages. She had not used either language in years. But the brain never forgets what it absorbed young. Every word those 2 men exchanged in that garage had landed in her mind fully formed, fully understood. Without effort. She wished it hadn't. 5 seconds faster retrieving that bag and she would have been in the elevator already. Doors closed, ascending, innocent, uninvolved. Instead she had been standing near the pillar beside the security booth when the 2 men appeared from behind the far SUV and began speaking in the low, unhurried Russian of people who believed themselves completely alone. She had gone still instinctively, not out of strategy but out of the animal response to something that felt immediately wrong. And then the words reached her. And then the meaning reached her. And then she understood that the man walking toward the black car had approximately 40 seconds before he made the last mistake of his life. She had not thought after that. She had simply moved. Kang Ji-ho. That was his name. She knew it the way all residents of the building knew it. Carefully, quietly, with the specific discretion people applied to names that carried weight. He occupied the penthouse. He arrived and departed at irregular hours. He moved through shared spaces with the kind of authority that did not require announcement and did not invite conversation. She had shared an elevator with him exactly once 3 weeks prior. He had not spoken. She had not spoken. He had noted her floor number when she pressed the button. A single glance, brief and complete, and those few seconds had been the entire history between them. Until now. When he turned and looked at her across the garage floor, she felt something she had not anticipated. Not fear, not relief, but the particular sensation of being seen by someone whose attention had genuine weight behind it. He was looking at her the way people rarely looked at her. Not past her, not through her, not with the casual unseeing quality that most people brought to their awareness of others. Directly. Completely. With the full force of a mind that missed nothing. She held his gaze without flinching. A black woman in a winter coat with a forgotten bag over her shoulder, standing in a parking garage in the middle of the night, having just spoken Korean to a man she had never properly met. She watched him take that in. She watched him decide she was not what he expected. She watched something shift, fractionally, almost invisibly, in the controlled landscape of his face. "Say that again," he said. "Do not enter that car," she said. He looked at her for one more measured moment. Then he spoke once over his shoulder and the garage rearranged itself around his decision. A second vehicle. New positions. And then he was gone, up the ramp and into the rain above, and she was standing alone in the space where he had been, breathing in the cold air of a night that had just changed everything. The original black car continued idling in front of her. Patient. Waiting. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she pressed the elevator button, stepped inside, and let the doors close around her. She was still thinking about the way he had looked at her when she reached her floor. She had not been looked at like that in a very long time. By the following morning she knew she was being watched. Nothing announced it directly. No one knocked on her door. No one appeared too close in the lobby or manufactured reasons to occupy her space. But there was a quality to the attention that followed her through the building that day which was different from ordinary awareness. A deliberate stillness that entered every room she walked into. A sense of observation that had both direction and intention. She felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives. Something invisible was oriented toward her, and she could not yet see its face. She went to work. She returned. She made dinner she barely tasted. She heard nothing from anyone. The following evening a plain card appeared beneath her apartment door. No name. An address across the city and a single time. 8 o'clock. Nothing further. She stood in the center of her living room holding that card for longer than she would admit. She was not frightened in the way that shuts a person down. She was frightened in the way that sharpens everything. The way her father had once described walking toward a truth you had been circling for years, knowing that the moment you reached it everything would rearrange permanently. She thought about not going. She thought about calling Nicole and inventing a reason to be elsewhere for a few days. Then she thought about that car still idling in her memory. She put on her coat. The address belonged to a building that announced nothing about itself. No name on the exterior, no visible signage, the kind of structure that existed on certain streets through a mutual agreement with everything around it to remain unacknowledged. A man met her at the entrance without speaking and walked her to a private elevator and remained outside as the doors closed. She ascended alone. The room at the top was large and deliberately sparse. Floor-to-ceiling glass held the city at a distance. All light and depth and the particular beauty of a place observed from high enough that its chaos resolves into something almost peaceful. And standing in front of that glass with his back to the room was Kang Ji-ho. He did not turn when she entered. The sight of him, broad shoulders, dark coat, perfectly still against the blazing city backdrop, produced something in her chest she was not prepared for. Something that arrived without permission and departed just as quickly, leaving only the faint awareness that it had been there at all. She filed it carefully and said nothing. "How do you know Korean?" he said. "My father's postings," she said. "We lived in Seoul for 4 years. And Russian." Pause, brief but present. "Moscow before that." He turned. The city light came from behind him now, putting one side of his face in clarity and leaving the other in shadow. He studied her with that same leveled attention, patient, thorough, returning nothing. And yet something was different from the garage. In the garage he had been assessing a variable. Here, in this quiet room with no audience and no urgency, he was doing something else entirely. Something that felt less like calculation and more like curiosity. She noticed. She said nothing. "You understand what you walked into," he said. "I understand what I heard," she said carefully. "Those are not the same thing." She did not answer that. She held his gaze and allowed the silence between them to carry what words would have cheapened. He moved to the glass table near the window and rested both hands on the back of a chair. The car was inspected, he said. Thoroughly. No device. No tampering of any kind. Nothing that explained what you said to me. He paused. So I am left with two possibilities. Either you fabricated the warning for reasons of your own, or you prevented something that cannot now be proven. I know what I heard, she said. Then tell me exactly. Every word. She repeated the Russian conversation back to him. Not paraphrased, the actual words, the precise rhythm, the sequence of phrases including the pauses between them. She watched something alter in his expression as she spoke. Not surprise. Something more structural. The look of a man discovering a gap in a wall he had been certain was solid. When she finished, the room held its silence. You left something out, he said. She had. One phrase. For words she had placed in a protected interior space and was not yet willing to surface. She looked at him without shifting. No, she said. He studied her for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed temperature. Barely, almost imperceptibly, but she caught it. You are a very deliberate person, he said. Not accusation. Something that sounded almost like appreciation. Yes, she said simply. Something moved across his face then. Brief and unguarded and gone before she could fully read it. He looked away from her for the first time since she had entered the room. Looked at the city below instead, jaw tight, processing something he was not ready to hand to her yet. She understood that feeling completely. Go home, he said finally. Speak to no one. I will be in contact. She stood to leave. She was nearly at the door when his voice came quietly behind her. The car, he said. You said do not enter. Not run. Not leave. You were very specific. Panic creates noise, she said. Noise would have told them the warning had been delivered. A long silence. Who taught you that? He said. She considered what answering would open. Someone who believed that the right language, chosen carefully, was the most powerful thing a person could carry, she said. She left without looking back. But she felt his eyes on her until the door closed between them, and that feeling stayed with her all the way home. The days that followed moved with a particular quality of suspension that precedes significant events, the world drawing breath, holding it, deciding. Serena maintained her routine with the discipline she had spent years constructing. Morning language classes at the university, where she stood at the front of a room and coaxed Korean and Russian out of students who mostly wanted the aesthetic of multilingualism without the labor of it. Afternoon office hours. Evening walks that were partly for air and partly for the specific kind of thinking that only happened when her body was in motion. She was, to anyone observing her surface, completely ordinary. Composed. Unhurried. Beneath that surface she was cataloging everything. The replacement of one of the Russian guards happened on the third day. The tall one, the one with the crescent scar below his left ear, was simply gone. A new face appeared in his position. Younger. More contained. Eyes that moved differently, not scanning for threat the way trained security scans, but watching in the specific way of someone who is reporting rather than protecting. She added this to what she knew and said nothing. On the fifth day the summons came again. Same building. Different floor. A smaller room this time. Dark wood paneling, low light. 2 chairs positioned near a table with the kind of deliberate arrangement that suggested the conversation ahead had been carefully planned. Kang Ji-ho was already seated when she entered. He looked up when she walked in. That was all. Just looked up. But there was something in the way his eyes found her immediately. Not searching, not scanning, simply arriving at her as though they already knew where she was. That produced the same uninvited sensation she had felt in that first room. She sat down across from him and arranged her face into its most neutral expression, and told herself firmly that she was here for one reason and one reason only. I need everything again, he said. Every word. Complete this time. I gave you everything relevant. You gave me everything you chose to classify as relevant. He leaned forward slightly. In the low light of this room without the dramatic city backdrop, he looked different. Less like a figure of authority and more like a man, tired in the deep structural way, carrying something heavy and long held. That is a different standard. She looked at him for a moment. Then she made a decision. One of the men in that garage, she said carefully, used a name. A surname. I withheld it because I needed to verify something before placing it in anyone else's hands. Verify what? Whether it was the same person I have been looking for, she said. Or simply someone using that identity as an operational marker. He waited, creating space rather than pressing. She had noticed this about him, the patience, the deliberate stillness, the understanding that pressure produced performance rather than truth. It was, she thought, one of the most quietly compelling things about him. She pushed that thought aside immediately. The name was Volkov, she said. The shift in his posture was minimal, controlled. But she caught it. A dead man, he said quietly. Or a dead man's name attached to a living structure, she said. Which is considerably more dangerous. He reached forward and slid a photograph across the table toward her without breaking eye contact. Black and white. Security feed quality. A man of middle age with a face that was individually unremarkable, but collectively produced something that made the back of her neck respond before her mind caught up with why. She knew that face. From years of careful patient research conducted in the margins of a life she had constructed specifically to conceal it. She kept her expression level. But her hands, folded in her lap, pressed together with slightly more force than before. He noticed. His eyes dropped to her hands for just a fraction of a second and then returned to her face. That fraction of a second felt strangely intimate, the sense of being observed not as a variable but as a person. She did not know what to do with that, so she set it aside. You recognize him, he said. I know of him, she said. The distinction mattered. Who are you, he said. Actually. It was the first question he had asked that reached past the garage and the strategy and the careful professional distance they had both been maintaining. Something in the way he said it, quietly without pressure, with what felt genuinely like wanting to know, made her throat tighten slightly before she controlled it. A woman who heard something she was not intended to hear, she said. And before that, the daughter of a man who died in a location he had no business being in. Caught at the edge of something that was never about him. She paused. That is what I am prepared to say tonight. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that she had not seen on him before. Something that was not calculation, not assessment, not the controlled processing of information. Something that looked briefly and unmistakably like the expression of a man who had just been trusted with something fragile and understood the weight of it. We are finished for tonight, he said quietly. She stood to leave, nearly at the door when his voice came behind her. The replacement in my detail, he said. He was not my selection. She turned. I know, she said. I noticed. He looked at her across the length of the room. You noticed, he repeated, slower this time, like a man recalibrating something he had been measuring incorrectly, like a man who was beginning to understand that the woman standing at his door was considerably more than the variable he had originally filed her as. She held his gaze for one moment longer than necessary. Then she left. And in the elevator going down she pressed her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and told herself, clearly and firmly, that she did not have room for this. Not now. Not in the middle of all of this. Her heart, unfortunately, was not listening. And honestly, have you ever tried to talk yourself out of something your heart had already decided? Subscribe, hit the like button, and drop a comment below telling me if you think Serena stands a chance against what she is already feeling. Because we both know the answer. Keep watching. The invitation arrived through the university, a cultural exchange gala, formally organized, the kind of evening where diplomats and their adjacent circles moved through a large room conducting conversations that sounded like small talk but were actually the surface layer of negotiations running for months. Serena attended these events twice a year. She was usually invisible at them. That invisibility was not accidental. It was cultivated. She dressed without enthusiasm, arrived on time, accepted a drink she would not finish, found her colleague near the far windows and entered the ambient conversation about curriculum restructuring that would occupy the next 20 minutes of her life. She did not expect Kang Ji-ho to be there. She registered his presence the way you register a change in a room's atmosphere before identifying its source. A subtle pull at the periphery of her awareness that she followed without deciding to. He was across the room near the far wall, in conversation with a man she did not recognize, appearing entirely at ease while being the most comprehensively attentive person present. He wore something that still read as authority but carried it without effort tonight, the way certain people wear their power when they have stopped needing to announce it. She looked away deliberately. She was mid-sentence about departmental budgets when the laughter reached her. Full and unguarded and immediately recognizable. The particular laugh of someone who finds genuine delight in the world rather than performing it. She turned. Nicole. Her younger sister was standing 3 meters away, having materialized out of the social current of the evening with the effortless quality she brought to every room. 23 years old. Warm and luminous and entirely comfortable inside her own skin. The kind of person who turned a room toward her not because she demanded anything but because being near her felt, inexplicably, like standing in sunlight. She had come with a friend from her design program on the promise that the evening would be interesting. The moment between the sisters was immediate. Nicole crossed to her with pure unperformed delight. They embraced. Nicole said something teasing about Serena's dress. Serena returned something dry. They were still laughing when the small surrounding group shifted and a new presence settled at the edge of their circle. Your sister. The voice was Korean. Quiet. Already familiar. She turned. Kang Ji-ho stood at a respectful distance. But his eyes had moved immediately to Nicole with a particular quality of attention that registers something unexpected, and finds it genuinely worth examining. Nicole's warmth. Nicole's ease. Nicole's complete and uncomplicated openness. It was, Serena knew, almost impossible not to respond to. Nicole turned toward the voice with the natural warmth she extended to every new person. Yes, she said brightly, offering her hand. Nicole. Whatever she has told you about me, I was much younger then. She hasn't mentioned you at all, he said, shaking her hand. Nicole laughed. Genuinely without performance, and something in Kang Ji-ho shifted. Subtle. Almost imperceptible. But present. He was not simply being polite. He was comfortable. Actually comfortable, in the way he rarely appeared to be with anyone, drawn forward by something in Nicole's energy that had nothing to do with strategy. The conversation that followed was brief. He asked Nicole about her work. She answered with her whole self, expressive, generous, genuinely enthusiastic. He listened with actual attention. He asked a follow-up question that demonstrated he had absorbed everything she said. Nicole responded with increasing animation, her hands moving the way they always moved when she was genuinely engaged. Serena stood beside them and said nothing. She examined herself carefully for jealousy and found something more complicated. A watchful stillness, a precise awareness of everything unfolding in front of her. Nicole was warm and magnetic and entirely herself, and Jiho was responding to that authenticity, the way a man responds when he encounters something uncomplicated in the middle of a very complicated life. She understood it. She did not blame him for it. What she also noticed, and this she filed with the same careful attention she brought to everything, was that every 30 seconds or so, without breaking the flow of his conversation with Nicole, Jiho's eyes moved briefly to her. Not to Nicole. To her. Just for a moment. Then back to Nicole. Then back to her again. Each time lasting precisely 1 second too long to be accidental. Each time carrying something she could not name but could absolutely feel. Nicole noticed too. Of course she did. When he eventually moved on, Nicole turned to her immediately with a look that contained everything she was too careful to say aloud in a public room. Serena received the look and returned nothing. He kept looking at you, Nicole said quietly. He was speaking to you, Serena said. Yes, Nicole said, with the quiet precision that lived beneath all her warmth. And looking at you. Every few seconds. Like he was trying not to and failing completely. She paused. Does he know you that well already? We have had a few conversations, Serena said carefully. Nicole studied her for a long moment. A few conversations, she repeated slowly. Then she smiled. Not the full open smile she gave the world, but the smaller private one she reserved for moments when she understood something her sister was not yet ready to discuss. Right, she said softly. A few conversations. Nicole. I did not say anything, Nicole said innocently, turning back to her drink. Serena looked at the city through the glass. Across the room without turning, she was aware of exactly where Jiho stood. That awareness had a texture she was running out of names for. Something warm. Something persistent. Something that had been growing quietly in the margins of everything else, and was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. She ignored it anyway. For now. The dead man appeared on a Tuesday, in the specific way that absences announce themselves to people trained to read them. She had been tracking his position in the building's periphery for several days. Not the original one, not the scar-faced man who had vanished early, but a different one. Compact, gray-templed, with the unhurried stillness of someone who had spent decades in proximity to danger until danger had become simply the medium he existed in. She had noticed him the way she noticed all things that mattered. Quietly. Without appearing to. Filing each observation carefully. On Tuesday morning the position he always occupied was empty. By Tuesday afternoon the building had a quality she recognized. That particular held-breath tension of a collective that knows something has happened and has not yet decided how to speak of it. She moved through it without breaking her surface. She taught her class. She answered correspondence. She walked back slowly from the coffee place 2 streets over, and felt the shift in the air with the steady attention of someone who has been waiting for things to accelerate. They were accelerating now. The phone recording surfaced by Wednesday evening. She did not know its origin or the chain of hands it had passed through. What she knew was that by Wednesday night she was back in the dark study, and this time the table between them held no folder. Only a phone face up, an audio file loaded and waiting. Kang Ji-ho pressed play without preamble. The recording was distorted in the way of something captured without intention. Ambient noise blurring the edges. A voice stripped of its warmth and left with only its architecture. But within that distortion, rising through it in fragments, was her voice. Or something assembled to sound precisely like her voice, carrying the specific cadence she brought to Russian when she spoke it carefully. For words delivered with total deliberateness. He knows. The file ended. The room held its silence completely. She looked at the phone. She looked at him. His face had closed entirely, every surface smooth, every calculation running inward, waiting for her to speak first. The air between them had the quality of a moment that would define everything depending entirely on what was said next. That is not what I said, she said. What did you say? I said he does not know. She kept her voice even. The recording was edited to remove the negative. The meaning is completely inverted. Why would someone invert it? To position me as working against you, she said. And to position the man who died as someone who needed to be removed, because of what I allegedly told him. He was quiet. His eyes had not moved from her face. In the low light of the room they held something she could not immediately classify. Not anger, not suspicion, but something that looked almost like conflict. Like a man fighting two conclusions simultaneously, and not yet certain which one to trust. "Did you work against me?" he said. She let the question exist between them for a full moment. Not because she feared it, because she needed him to see that she did not. "No," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Minimal, but present. "The man who died," she said carefully, "carried a direct connection to the organization I have been tracking for 6 years. An organization responsible for a confrontation in which a man attending a legitimate diplomatic meeting was killed, because he was present when presence became inconvenient." She stopped, drew one quiet breath. "My father was not a participant in anything. He was there because it had started to rain and he stepped inside a building to wait for it to pass. Someone decided a clean resolution required no witnesses. My father had no idea what he had witnessed. It made no difference to them." The room was very still. Kang Ji-ho looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that had nothing to do with strategy. A response that was purely human, purely felt, arriving before his control could intercept it. His jaw tightened slightly. His eyes held hers with an intensity that was no longer assessment. It was something else entirely. "Volkov ordered it," he said quietly. "Volkov designed the protocol that made it possible," she said. "His structure absorbed his reported death and continued operating. The name became a designation, passed between operatives to signal authorization." She paused. "The man in your garage used it to authorize the action against you, which means the structure has detailed access to your movements, your schedule, and your security composition." He stood and moved to the window, hands in his pockets, the city continuing its indifferent motion behind him. He stood there long enough that the silence became its own communication, not empty, not uncomfortable, but the silence of two people separately arriving at the same understanding. "You have been running this alone," he said finally. "For 6 years," she said. "Without resources, without allies, without drawing attention I could not afford. And then you walked into my garage. And then I came back for a forgotten bag," she said, "and heard 2 men plan your death in a language they had no reason to believe I understood." He turned from the window, and the way he looked at her in that moment, directly, completely, with something that had moved entirely past professional assessment into something raw and unguarded, made her breath catch before she controlled it. "Why tell me everything tonight?" he said. His voice was quieter than usual, lower. "Because I am no longer invisible to them," she said. "Which means we are inside this together now." He crossed the room slowly and stopped in front of her, closer than he had ever stood before. Close enough that she could see the exact moment something shifted in his eyes, something that had been carefully contained for weeks finally moving to the surface. "Together," he repeated quietly. She held his gaze. "Together," she confirmed. Neither of them moved. The space between them held something neither was ready to name but both could feel with absolute clarity. The rain came back that night with the quiet insistence of something that had unfinished business. She heard it before she registered it consciously, a deepening of the sound beyond her windows, the city softening at its edges. She had been standing in her kitchen with a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink when the knock came at her door. Once. Quiet. The kind of knock that does not demand but expects. Kang Ji-ho was standing in her hallway with rain on the shoulders of his dark coat. No explanation for why he had come here rather than summoning her to one of his controlled spaces. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who had simply needed to go somewhere that was not one of his own rooms. Like a man who had needed to come to her specifically. "May I come in?" he said. She stepped back from the door. He entered and stood in the center of her living room. The space felt different with him in it, smaller, warmer, charged with something that had been building across weeks of careful rooms and careful distances. She stood near the kitchen doorway and waited. "He confessed," he said finally. "The replacement in my detail. By midnight he had given enough to confirm everything you told me." He paused. The car was a secondary action, a visible threat designed to absorb response resources, while the primary operation continued undisturbed. "They wanted to observe how you moved," she said. "Who you contacted. Who went quiet under pressure. Yes. Your intervention broke their diagnostic completely." He paused. "You did not plan that." "I came back for a bag," she said. He looked at her then with something that was no longer professional, no longer controlled, something that had been waiting behind all the careful weeks of careful words, and was now simply present in the room between them whether either of them had invited it or not. "You keep saying that," he said quietly. "Like it explains everything." "Doesn't it?" she said. "No," he said. "It explains nothing. A woman who grew up in 3 countries, who speaks 4 languages, who noticed a replaced guard that my own people missed, who has been running a private 6-year investigation alone." He paused. "That woman does not come back for a bag, Serena. That woman came back for something. I am just not certain yet what it was." It was the first time he had used her name. The sound of it in his mouth in Korean cadence, landing with unexpected gentleness, did something to her she was entirely unprepared for. She looked at him steadily and said nothing and hoped the silence covered what had just crossed her face. It did not. He saw it. She watched him see it. And she watched him make the decision, slowly and deliberately, not to look away from it. "Tell me about your father," he said quietly, moving to sit not across from her but beside her. Close. The warmth of him present and specific. She talked about a man who loved every language he encountered with physical joy, who became measurably lighter when practicing one he was still learning, who drove their family through rain in 4 countries and maintained that rain sounded different in every city, who told her at 11 years old that the discomfort of newness was not a problem to be solved but a capacity to be developed, who believed that speaking someone's language was the most profound act of respect one person could offer another, who had stepped inside a building one rainy afternoon and never come home. Her voice did not break. But at some point during the telling, without either of them marking the moment it happened, Jiho's hand had moved to cover hers where it rested on the cushion between them. Still. Warm. Not demanding anything. Simply there. She looked down at it. His hand over hers. His world and hers occupying the same small space. The same quiet moment. The same grief that belonged to her but that he was choosing, without words, to share the weight of. She did not move her hand. "He deserved more time," Jiho said quietly. "Yes," she said. Simply. Nothing added. They sat in the kind of silence that no longer required management. At some point he stood to leave. She walked him to the door. He put on his coat and stood in the open doorway and looked at her with the expression she had been slowly learning, the one that existed before his control reasserted itself. "I cannot read Russian," he said quietly, "but I think I am learning your language." "What language is that?" she said. "The one where silence contains more than speech," he said. "Where a woman returns for a forgotten bag at midnight and changes everything and asks for nothing in return." He paused. "I am learning it." Slowly. She looked at him for a long moment. "You are a fast learner," she said softly. Something in his expression shifted. Warm and unguarded and entirely real. He held her gaze for one long moment. Then he left. The door closed. 3 nights later she was back in the parking garage. The rain that night was lighter, more suggestion than storm. He was already there. He turned when he heard her. He did not appear surprised. They stood in the low light and neither spoke for a long moment. What comes next? He said quietly. We find Volkov, she said. The real one. And after that? She looked at him steadily. We find out who we are when this is over. Then she turned toward the elevator. Almost there when she stopped. Slightly angled back. And the words came out in Russian, low, precise, deliberate. You are closer to death than you think. Pause behind her. Then his voice quiet and careful. What did you say? The elevator doors parted. She stepped inside and turned to face them as they closed. And across the full length of that garage, in the last narrow moment before the gap sealed completely, she found his eyes. She smiled. Just slightly. Just enough. The doors closed. The garage held its silence. And somewhere in the city surrounding that building something was finally shifting into position, preparing to reveal everything this had always truly been about. If you stayed until the very last word, this channel was made for you. Hit that like button right now, subscribe so you never miss a story, and drop a comment below. Was that final whisper a warning, a threat, or a promise only he was meant to understand? Tell us everything. And come back because Serena is not finished. And neither is Volkov.